Hi, it's your game developer friend Troy again. In my previous video, I outlined the case that the Tropes vs. Women series presents a view of video games that reflects Anita Sarkeesian's narrow viewpoint. I said she was viewing video games through an ideological pinhole, and therefore her alleged research into sexism in games is actually a form of propaganda. And I gave a small handful of examples of how she does this. Now, if you followed this controversy, you'll know that my position is nothing new. Most of the videos criticizing the series make this exact same point. For example, the biochemist Dr. Phil Mason, also known on YouTube as Thunderfoot, found the Feminist Frequency series to be so slanted that he brought his scientific training to the fray.
You see, we are part of a sexually dimorphic species. That is, males and females tend to have different physical characteristics. Look, the reason that we divide the Olympics up by sex is not because we are inherently sexist. It's because men and women tend to have different traits. On average, in the upper body strength, it's almost 50% difference. Oh, come on, tell me again how this is really a myth.
The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false.
And I've not seen the study yet, but I'm going to go out there on a limb and predict that there will be no correlation whatsoever between the number of damsel in distress video games and the ensemble differences in the upper body strength between men and women.
So, even though I could go on and on pointing out how Anita's ideology is heavily skewing every word she speaks, I don't want to retread what has already been done. Instead, I want to explore a different facet. Anita says this.
So why does any of this matter? What's the real harm in sexually objectifying women? Well, the negative impacts of sexual objectification have been studied extensively over the years, and the effects on people of all genders are quite clear and very serious. Research has consistently found that exposure to these types of images negatively impacts perceptions and beliefs about real-world women, and reinforces harmful myths about sexual violence.
That's a pretty strong statement. And to be fair, even though Anita is very lopsided in what she presents, there can be no doubt that we do see a lot of sexualized women within a certain subset of games. And in many of those games, violence against women is permitted. If you watch the Tropes series, you'll very quickly get the impression that the sexualization of women in video games is pervasive. It seems to be everywhere. If Anita's sample set is anywhere near representative, then one might be led to conclude we are facing some kind of an epidemic. So, is it possible that, if we look beyond Anita's skewed ideology, that maybe there really is something harmful going on here? Is this a case of where there is smoke, there is fire? Is sexism in games actually problematic?
Houston, we have a problem.
In order to do fair justice to this question, I'm going to do a radical thing and temporarily follow Anita's oft-repeated plea to just listen and believe. Rather than getting bogged down in the details of each instance of alleged sexism in games, I'll just go with her premise that it, at some level, genuinely exists in the games that she calls out. My hope is that, by so doing, we can begin to define the scope of the problem. Just how many games do sexualize women in the negative way that Feminist Frequency finds so troubling? If you watch the Tropes vs. Women videos closely, you start to notice that Anita returns to use the same games again and again and again. For example, Hitman Absolution is called out in 6 different videos. When I noticed this, I decided to look in the notes she provides after each video where she lists the games that she's using. You'll note that there are quite a lot of them, but also that they cover a really large span of time going all the way back for decades. Also, Anita doesn't find fault with everything she lists as a reference. For example, she doesn't seem to have much of a problem with the game like Portal. So, let's make a list of all the games in the series that she has somehow found problematic and that have been released during the same years that the Tropes vs. Women series has been going on, from 2012 until today in 2016. Now, sometimes Anita calls out E-rated titles that she finds troubling in some way, like Super Monkey Ball, or Sonic Lost World, or even Disney's Where's My Water, because the female alligator wears a little pink bow on her head. Anyway, when we do that and include even the E-rated games, here's the list of games we get. There are 99 of them. A pretty sizable list, right? But how much of the industry do those games actually represent? To figure that out, we can start by checking Wikipedia to look at all the games released year by year over the same time frame. In 2012, there were 748. In 2013, there were 617. In 2014, 544. In 2015, 492. And to date, in 2016, there were 315. All summed up, this makes for a total of 2,716 games released in the years from 2012 till 2016. Anita's list of 99 offenders, including the E-rated titles, constitute just 3.7% of the releases. So, maybe the problem is not that pervasive. But let's be honest here, and further refine this list down to the ones that are the worst offenders. Those that are supposedly bad because they have an M rating. Games like Grand Theft Auto 5. These are the games that Anita hammers on repeatedly. Now when you do this, getting rid of the E and T rated games, roughly half of the list of offenders goes away. Anita calls out 46 M-rated titles between the years of 2012 and 2016. Now when you do the math, you get only 1.6%. So it would appear that Ms. Sarkeesian is focusing in on a problem that impacts less than 2% of the total games released year over year. That's interesting, isn't it? You certainly don't get that impression from watching the Feminist Frequency series. So maybe I should include a little footnote, just for accuracy's sake. And I suppose if you're offended by one of those 46 M-rated games, you could always just go play one of the nearly 2,700 others. Again, games are pretty inclusive. There's something now out there for everyone. But even if it is a tiny subset of released games, Anita is right about one thing. Those M-rated games are very popular within a certain, predominantly male, hardcore gamer demographic. There's no disputing that. So maybe if there aren't a lot of games out there, perhaps the ones that do exist are having a drastic effect. Maybe they're insidiously creating a new wave of slavering heteropatriarchal sexists, and they don't even know it.
Viewing media that frames women as objects or sexual playthings profoundly impacts how real-life women are perceived and treated in the world around us. And that is all without even taking into account how video games allow for a more participatory form of objectification. In short, the more you think you cannot be affected, the more likely you are to be affected.
They want the male video game culture to die.
This is Jack Thompson. Gamers who have been around a while recognize him as a Florida attorney who tried to make the case that violent video games induce players also to commit violence. He repeatedly called such games murder simulators. Mr. Thompson became famous, or infamous, because he filed numerous multi-million-dollar lawsuits against game publishers claiming that their games led to all kinds of violent acts. For example, in 2007, he tried to tie the Virginia Tech shooting to the game Counter-Strike and even sent a letter to Bill Gates saying, "Mr. Gates, your company is potentially legally liable for the harm done at Virginia Tech. Your game, a killing simulator, trained him to enjoy killing and how to kill." Well, Mr. Thompson's influence has dropped off significantly since he was permanently disbarred from the practice of law in 2008 for making false statements and for inappropriate conduct. But he did have one positive effect. He sparked a lot of research into the impact of violence in video games. Now, for a while, in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were some small studies which seemed to support Mr. Thompson's claim. But these studies later proved to be heavily biased, performed under poor conditions, and decidedly non-scientific. Finally, in 2010, some large, longitudinal studies were done, and, well,
Now, those concerns over violence sort of died down, especially when the Psychological Bulletin published a major article in 2010 declaring the video game scare was, quote, much ado about nothing. And one graph showed that as video games have surged in popularity, youth crime has plummeted.
the alleged link between fantasy violence in video games and violence in the real world have been largely discredited. So what then are we to think of Ms. Sarkeesian's statements?
Well, the negative impacts of sexual objectification have been studied extensively over the years, and the effects on people of all genders are quite clear and very serious.
Well, what studies? She never mentions any in her video series, and you can't find any in the notes below.
Gender critics have to show, not dogmatically assume, that video games make men sexist and unjust or hold women back in some way. They haven't even tried to meet the burden of proof.
However, if you are persistent and dig for a while, you can find some links on the Feminist Frequency website. But in looking at these, many of them are just links to articles, books, or talks that she likes. But just linking to someone else who agrees with your ideology doesn't constitute an actual study. It's just more confirmation bias and propaganda. But let's not give up just yet. Well, it turns out that you can indeed find some small studies that, at first blush, seem to be supporting her position. For example, there's this one. This study, conducted as a senior honors thesis by a single person, claims to have discovered that video gamers are slightly more likely to find sexist chat messages to be funny. You could just as easily interpret that same tiny bit of data to conclude that video gamers have a better sense of humor, or are more relaxed about sexist jokes. Not a strong causal link there. Or this one, which shows that if you have one group play a game that is widely regarded as violent and sexist, such as Grand Theft Auto, and another one plays something non-violent, like a pinball game, for 35 minutes, the group that plays the sexist and violent game is likely to eat more candy while they play. M&M's specifically. But really, this is pretty weak stuff and doesn't support Feminist Frequency's position much, if at all. What we need is something like what was done with violence. A large, impartial, longitudinal study looking at sexist attitudes across a big group of gamers covering several years. There just happens to be one of those. This study started back in 2011, and it covered over 800 gamers across a span of 3 years. It was independently funded by the European Research Council. The study was based around cultivation theory, which posits that long-term exposure to media content can affect our perception of the world around us. The results broadly show that playing video games doesn't make people sexist. And this is the biggest and best study done to date. Also, there's this. Just like with violence, as the sales of video games have surged, the rate of sexual assault against females has declined. I wonder why Feminist Frequency doesn't ever reference this study or these facts. Anyway, let's sum up. M-rated games that seriously sexualize women turn out to constitute less than 2% of the titles released, and the largest study of gamers done to date shows no link between gaming and sexism, and the rate of sexual assault against women has been declining as video game sales have surged. So maybe that smoke we're seeing in the Tropes vs. Women series isn't from an actual fire, rather, it's from a smokescreen. I stand by my position. Video games are the most egalitarian form of entertainment ever created. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, cheers and game on!